Welcome. Take a deep breath. Let the day settle behind you. And let your thoughts soften like candle wax slowly melting in the quiet of an old stone chamber. You're listening to boring history for sleep, where the past unfolds gently, slowly, and always with a whisper. Tonight, we will be drifting back to the Middle Ages, but we won't be wading into the noise of battles or the clang of iron on the field. No, tonight, we're interested in something quieter, something all of us share, whether in the year 1250 or 2025. Sleep, or more precisely, the strange, forgotten, and deeply human ways people used to sleep during the medieval period. Because their nights were long, their rooms were cold, and their dreams, like ours, were shaped by everything they feared and hoped and believed. From split sleep and shared beds, to church bells at midnight and sleepwalkers mistaken for the possessed. We'll explore the unusual slumber of medieval men and women. But don't worry, you won't need to remember any of it. Just let it drift past like an evening breeze through a crumbling abbey. We'll begin, as always, by stepping gently into daily life. Let's settle in and let the rhythm of their world begin to lull us. Imagine yourself in a village where the air smells faintly of smoke and earth. The sky is heavy with stars, and there is no hum of electricity, no glowing screen, no quiet refrigerator, only the faint hiss of a dying fire and the slow, steady breathing of people already tucked into their strange, shared sleep. In the medieval world, sleep was very different from ours, not just in when or how, but in what it meant. For most people, sleep came when the light disappeared, not just because they were tired, but because they had no real choice. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval rest was what we now call segmented sleep. Unlike our modern 8-hour block, medieval people often slept in 2 parts. They would go to bed shortly after dusk, perhaps around 8 or 9 p.m. sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. This period of wakefulness, usually around midnight to 2 a.m., wasn't seen as a problem. It was simply part of the rhythm of the night. They called this time the watch. And during the watch, people might tend to the fire, use the chamber pot, pray, or meditate, check on livestock, write in journals, if literate, or even visit neighbors. There are scattered records of monks composing verses in the dark, of peasants talking quietly by lamplight, and even of couples using this time for intimacy, believing. Curiously, that conception was more likely during the second sleep. After the watch, they would return to bed for their second sleep, a gentler, dream-heavy slumber that often carried them into morning. This pattern wasn't seen as strange or disordered. It was simply the body's natural rhythm in a world lit only by moon and fire. Now, imagine the place you'd be sleeping. It's likely not a bed as you know it. In a modest peasant household, the bed might be no more than a wooden frame filled with straw, dried reeds, or heather. Sometimes simply a pallet on the floor, tucked by the hearth. Bedding was minimal. Woolen blankets or coarse linen, sheets perhaps fur in wealthier homes, and in many cases, you wouldn't be alone. The idea of having your own bedlet, alone, your own room, was a luxury very few could afford. Families often slept together, parents, children, even servants in one room, sometimes even in one bed. Travelers staying overnight might also be offered space in a bed, especially at inns. There was little concept of personal space. Warmth mattered more. And in winter, sleep became a form of preservation. People would go to bed early, remain huddled under layers of cloth, and try to keep the cold from seeping into their bones. In castles and manor houses, things were more comfortable, but still far from modern. Beds were raised, often with curtains, to keep in warmth and provide a little privacy, but they could also be shared by ladies, waiting, children, or servants attending to their lord or lady. The idea of solitude in sleep was not the norm. Sleep was a shared human experience, often cramped and always essential. What would you hear as you drifted off? In the countryside, the lowing of cattle, the occasional howl of a dog, wind pushing through cracks in wooden shutters, the slow creak of timber as a cottage settled into night. In cities, especially walled towns, the clatter of late returners, the footsteps of night watchmen, and, occasionally, to bell. Some monastic communities rang matins in the middle of the night. And if you lived near an abbey, you might wake not to an alarm clock, but to the call of devotion. These midnight rituals formed the soundtrack of the medieval night. Repetitive, soft, inescapable. Sleep was more than rest. It was also spiritual. Many believe that during sleep, the soul could wander. Dreams were not just nonsense. They were often viewed as messages or even warnings. There was fear, too, that sleep made you vulnerable to spirits, demons, or curses. To guard against this, people might place charms beneath their pillows, hang protective herbs near the bed, or recite specific prayers to keep evil at bay. Superstition wove itself into the very fabric of sleep. A bad dream might mean something worse than indigestion. It might mean the devil had drawn close. But alongside fear, there was also trust. A trust that the night would pass, that the fire would stay lit, and that morning would return as it always had. In winter, the nights were long and cold, bitterly so. With no central heating, Even wealthier homes relied on fires, warm stones, and thick drapery. Most commoners simply endured it. They would layer clothing at night, even sleeping in cloaks and boots. Children were packed in clothes. Dogs, too, sometimes shared the warmth. Imagine now the feeling of wool against your skin, the faint tickle of straw poking through the mattress, the warmth of another body beside you, and the soft hush of darkness, broken only by the crackle of cooling embers. That was sleep for most medieval people. Practical, communal, segmented, and deeply human. As we leave behind the simple homes and shared bedding of ordinary folk, we'll shift now into something a little more focused. In our next segment, we'll follow one particular figure, someone whose sleep was shaped not just by custom, but by power, duty, and perhaps obsession. Now, let us leave the flickering hearths of the peasantry and ascend into stone halls, echoing with reverence and restraint. Tonight, we walk gently into the private life of a king. Not just any king, but Louis IX of France, canonized as Saint Louis, whose reign in the 13th century was marked by discipline, faith, and a curious, almost monastic relationship with sleep. He ruled a kingdom, led crusades, built churches, and yet, in the stillness of night, he lived more like a monk than a monarch. Louis IX's bedchamber was famously austere. Even at the height of his power, he refused the plush excesses expected of royalty. Where others might sleep on furs and feather mattresses, Louis chose simple straw bedding. He often slept in a hair-shirter rough garment designed to cause discomfort and remind him of spiritual humility. His attendants recorded that he kept his chamber cold, deliberately leaving fires unlit, even in winter. He believed comfort was a temptation, and sleep, if too luxurious, a danger to the soul. For him, sleep was not an escape. It was a spiritual battleground. Each night before rest, Louis followed a strict routine. He would wash his feet, both a physical cleansing and a symbolic act of humility, and then withdraw into prayer. For long stretches, sometimes hours, he would kneel silently, wrapped in a cloak, his breath visible in the chilled air. These weren't hurried bedtime prayers. They were structured, deliberate devotions, sometimes accompanied by readings from the Psalms or lives of the saints. He believed that the soul must be prepared for sleep in case it did not wake again. Like many in his time, Louis IX believed that death might come at any hour, and that the soul should never be caught unready. To die in one's sleep, without confession, without prayer, was a terrifying prospect. Thus, Louis ensured that he ended each day in a state of grace, having confessed, repented, and knelt in quiet reflection. His attendants were instructed to wake him gently if he stirred, so that no moment passed without awareness or control. Lewis's sleep was not only brief, was often interrupted deliberately. He would wake in the middle of the night, mirroring monastic hours, to pray once more before returning to rest. This echoed the divine office observed by monks, particularly the midnight office of matins, which divided the night into segments of rest and worship. For a king, this was highly unusual. Most monarchs prized uninterrupted sleep, both for strength and for sanity. But Louis saw fatigue as a small price to pay if it kept him spiritually vigilant. Louis IX also practiced fasts that affected his sleep. He often consumed very little food in the evenings, just bread, water, and occasionally a few vegetables. As a result, he frequently went to bed hungry and awoke before dawn, stomach hollow, to begin his day with more prayer. Some chroniclers suggest that his fasting and nightly discomfort brought him visions, or at least a kind of spiritual clarity. It's difficult to know how much of this was devotion, and how much may have bordered on self-punishment. But to Louis, suffering especially at night was not to be avoided. It was to be embraced, refined, and offered up. Imagine him now, alone in a vast chamber, wrapped in rough cloth, the stone walls whispering cold around him. A candle sputters in a corner. Somewhere, a watchman shifts his feet outside the door. But within, there is only the slow, labored rhythm of breath and the quiet murmur of scripture whispered into the dark. His sleep is light, interrupted, never indulgent. Even in dreams, he seeks no escape, only discipline and peace through self-denial. Louis IX would eventually die on crusade, far from the quiet sanctity of his Parisian chamber. But until the end, his nights reflected his deepest beliefs, that sleep was a time to prepare, not to forget. We will now drift once more, this time not into a single person's habits, but into the strange mysteries that surrounded medieval sleep itself. In our next segment, we'll explore the folklore, sleepwalking fears, dream beliefs, and bizarre bedtime rituals that wove through the night. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not merely a bodily function. It was a doorway, a space between worlds, a fragile moment when the veil between life and death, between reality and the unseen, seemed too thin. Tonight, let us step softly into this shadowed space, into the eerie and curious beliefs that shaped how medieval people understood their nights. To sleep in the medieval world was not entirely safe. It was a time when a person became vulnerable to illness, to demons, to strange creatures that, according to folklore, roamed freely in the dark. Many believed that evil spirits and witches were most powerful at night, known by some as the devil's hour. Known by some as the devil's hour, it was common to place protective objects near the bed, a cross above the door, a sprig of rosemary under the pillow, or a knife beneath the mattress knot for intruders, but to ward off spirits. The belief wasn't that one might die in their sleep. Today, we speak of nightmares, casually bad dreams that fade with the morning light. But to a medieval sleeper, a nightmare was often interpreted as a real encounter with the supernatural. In fact, the word nightmare comes from the Old English Maria, kind of malevolent being thought to sit on the chest of the sleeping, suffocating them and stealing their breath. These events were not brushed aside. People awoke trembling, convinced they had been attacked or possessed, and often they had rituals to combat these nocturnal visitations. Prayers, charms, or even exorcisms. The sleeping body was seen as open, and open things could be entered. Medieval people did not believe that dreams were meaningless. There were entire books written to help people interpret what they saw while asleep. Dreaming of fire might mean passion or hellfire. Dreaming of birds might mean a message is coming. And dreaming of falling could be a warning of sin or failure. Monks and clergy especially studied these meanings, consulting volumes like the Somniel Danielus, a popular medieval dream dictionary. Yet not all dreams were trusted. Some believed that Satan himself could plant dreams, twisting thoughts and tempting sleepers with false visions. To dream, then, was to take a risk. The image of a person rising from bed in the night, eyes blank, body stiff, and walking as if in a trance, is unsettling even today. But in the Middle Ages, sleepwalking was sometimes considered a spiritual affliction. Some saw it as a sign that a soul was being toyed with, that the body was under the influence of unseen forces. A person who sleepwalked might be viewed with suspicion. Others, however, believed the sleepwalker's soul was temporarily absent, having left the body during a dream or religious vision. It was not uncommon for people to speak of having seen things while asleep, angels, saints, devils, or even loved ones from beyond the grave. And so, if someone walked at night, murmuring strange things, people listened. They watched closely. Because the night had ears, bedtime was filled with quiet rituals, small acts of protection, repeated nightly, passed from parent to child. Many families avoided looking into mirrors before sleep, believing that reflections could trap part of the soul or allow something else to look back. Some would cover their mouths while yawning to prevent a spirit from entering. Others would avoid sleeping with their feet pointed toward the door, a posture too closely associated with death. Even the placement of the bed itself mattered. It was advised to sleep with one's head facing east, toward the Holy Land. To sleep facing north was said to invite unrest. And to sleep with your bed in line with a nearby graveyard, well, that was best avoided entirely. The moon, so often poetic in our modern imagination, held more ominous meanings in the medieval world. A full moon was thought to disturb sleep, to provoke strange dreams, and sometimes to stir madness. Some midwives advised pregnant women to stay indoors during a full moon, lest its light influence the unborn child. And for those prone to sleep disturbances or hallucinations, the moon was often blamed. Its pale glow slipping through shuttered windows was considered a silent, stirring force awakening things that preferred the dark. Believe it or not, sleeping too long or too soundly was seen as suspicious. A deep, unbroken sleep could mean laziness. Or worse, it could suggest you were under some sort of enchantment, spell, or spiritual oppression. Even in monasteries, excessive sleep was frowned upon. There were reports of monks being roused from slumber to recite psalms or complete penances for having dozed off too easily. Sleep, after all, was not to be indulged, was to be disciplined. And so, as we close this curious chapter of folklore and superstition, let the images drift lightly through your mind. The whispering of prayers, the flutter of rosemary leaves on a windowsill, the glint of a silver charm beneath a straw pillow, and the old, deep belief that night was never truly empty. We'll now move gently into our final segment. Together, we'll slip into the lives of those at the very top of medieval society: nobles, merchants, and clergy, and explore how the privileged and powerful slept differently, and what that said about them. While the peasantry curled up on straw pallets near the hearth, while monks rose for midnight prayers, and while the poor feared what might lurk in the darkness beyond their cottage walls, those at the very top of society drifted into slumber with quite a different rhythm. Let us now slip quietly into the candlelit chambers of nobles, merchants, and clergy, and examine what it meant to sleep in comfort, and what comfort truly meant in a time so distant. The bed itself was often the centerpiece of the upper-class home, both functional and symbolic, a demonstration of wealth and power. Unlike the simple mats or rough cots of the poor, a noble's bed was raised high off the floor, framed in carved oak or walnut, and enclosed in heavy curtains, not just for warmth, but for privacy and prestige. These bed curtains, often dyed rich reds or deep blues, were embroidered with family crests, hunting scenes, or religious symbols. The mattress might be stuffed with feathers, wool, or even down, though true softness was rare, even at the highest levels. Pillows were plump, sheets were sometimes linen, and atop it all, a fur-lined coverlet might rest warm and decadent. But the bed was not only for sleep. It was often where business was conducted. Guests were received, and even meals were taken. To be invited into someone's bedchamber, let alone to sit on their bed, was a mark of intimacy and trust. Of course, a nobleman or lady did not sleep alone, not entirely. Even in privacy, the room might contain a personal servant quietly sleeping on a smaller cot, ready to rise at the whisper of a command. In great houses, multiple attendants might sleep nearby in adjoining rooms, in the same chamber, or even curled up near the foot of the bed. Their tasks were often humble and unspoken. To stir the fire, fetch water, assist with nightclothes, or comfort a restless child. For noble children, a nursemaid or tutor might sleep nearby, a constant, quiet presence in the rhythm of upper-class life. In monasteries and cathedrals, senior monks and abbots also enjoyed greater comfort. Private cells, feathered beds, and insulated walls, rare luxuries afforded to those in religious power. For the wealthy, sleep was preceded by routine. Silken robes were slipped over the day's garments. In colder months, nightcaps, long, pointed, often elaborately decorated, were worn to preserve heat. Hands and feet might be wrapped in cloth. Some used scented oils or powders, lavender, rosewater, or myrrh to soothe the senses. Before bed, nobles might read from a book of ours, a short prayer guide. Others were read to by servants or family, often tales of saints, morality, or scripture. And in some courts, musicians were employed to play soft tunes by lute or harp as the household settled into sleep. Even among the rich, the segmented sleep pattern was typical. They, too, rose between first and second sleep. But while a peasant might tend to animals or stoke the fire, a noble might choose to write letters, read, pray, or enjoy a light repast. This midnight meal, sometimes called a little supper, might include bread, cheese, or spiced wine. It was taken in candlelight, often in silence or soft conversation. The house would remain still. Outside, the chill of the night would cling to the stones, and within, the flicker of torchlight might reflect against polished wood or painted walls. After this pause, the noble would return to bed, slipping once more into dreams. Wealth, of course, brought a different relationship to safety. Where peasants might have feared thieves or wolves in the night, the elite lived behind gates, walls, and watchmen. Great doors were barred. Servants stood guard. Dogs were kept in the courtyard. And yet, sleep could still be uneasy. For nobles were not without enemies, political, personal, or even spiritual. Some slept with a dagger nearby. Others had their beds constructed in hidden alcoves or behind screens. A few even employed sleeping potions, herbal mixtures meant to calm the nerves, brewed from poppy, mandrake, or henbane. These were risky, unpredictable, and sometimes laced with superstition. Still, the silence of a guarded hall offered a kind of peace unknown to the common folk. As the medieval world edged toward the Renaissance, a new class emerged. The wealthy urban merchant, neither noble nor peasant. These men and women lived in townhouses with modest luxuries. Their beds were smaller, their linens plainer, but they adopted the habits of the rich, where they could bed curtains, carved headboards, or even embroidered pillows. They too read before bed. They too rose in the night. And they too began to value sleep as a kind of personal investment, essential to health, success, and spiritual clarity. For merchants, the night was still, but the mind remained busy. Accounts to remember, letters to draft, ships to track. And yet, as with all people of the time, as our journey nears its end, we are left with this quiet realization that whether resting on straw or silk, surrounded by servants or shadows, every soul in the medieval world, were poor, faithful, or fearful, closed their eyes beneath the same night sky. They shared the same moon, listened to the same wind, and surrendered, however briefly, to the gentle pull of sleep. Let us now gently draw the curtain on this exploration. And so, as the candle burns low and the distant bells of time fade into stillness, we leave behind the flickering hearths and curtained beds of the Middle Ages. You have wandered quietly, gently through the world of long-forgotten nights. You've seen how the peasant curled close to warmth, how the monk rose in the still hours to murmur prayers in candlelight, how the sick and superstitious feared what dreams might bring, and how the powerful wrapped themselves in velvet and silence. It is strange, isn't it, how even in such a different world, one of wood smoke, woolen cloaks, and whispered psalms, the need for rest remained a shared and constant rhythm. Then, as now, the body craved stillness. Then, as now, the night unfolded in its slow and gentle way. The world of the medieval sleeper was smaller than ours, bound by stone walls and village fields. But the sleep they sought was not so different from yours. To be warm, to be safe, to escape the burdens of waking life, if only for a while. And now, perhaps, you feel that pull yourself. Let the images of the past drift softly behind your closed eyes. A flickering rushlight, a feather-stuffed mattress, a wind tapping softly at the shutter. The past is quiet now. The monks are asleep. The villagers breathe in unison beneath thatched roofs. Even the nobles, in their guarded chambers, have surrendered to slumber. You are not alone in your sleep. You never were. rest now. Let the rhythm of history, slow and sure, carry you into dreams. Good night.